Hello and good day, class. Today we will be learning about the first topic of our UTS class. This section introduces us to the journey of understanding the self. It highlights the S, E, L, and F, or in other words, the social, environmental, and other life factors that contribute to the development of the self. At the end of this section, you're expected to determine the different factors that contribute to our being. You will also be evaluating the impact of these factors through self-appraisal. And in other words, you will be making a paperwork that makes you give a self-rating to the different factors that contribute to the development of the self. And lastly, you will be synthesizing the influence of the factors of the self through a group assessment. Now, talking about the self, through our common language, the pronouns I and me basically describe the so-called self. Now, the self is a topic that is often talked about but largely go unnoticed. For the pronoun I, when it is used, it is likely highlighting the actor, meaning we are describing ourselves as the doer. Like when we talk about I will go to school, I will hang out with my friends, and I would like to eat burger. And on the other hand, when we speak of the pronoun me, it is usually used as the object, or in other words, you are the subject in a particular statement. Just like when you say, tell me about it, give me something, or it makes me feel awesome. Noticeably, the self composes both the I as an actor and the me as the object, and the focus on the self is even more evident in the functional word variations of I and me that is used every single day when we use language depending on purpose. Now, borrowing the definition of social psychology as it defined the self, it says that it is a multi-level system, not simply reducible to genes or our neurons, meaning we cannot just deduce our being into the physical aspects of ourselves, but rather it is an emerging entity from interactions of the mechanisms operating at the neural level, or the different functions of our brain and its chemistry. Another factor being described here is the psychological aspect, meaning to say that the person is comprised of the different mental processes and the emotional faculty of the individual, and including the person's behavioral patterns. And lastly, we have the social levels, which pertain to one's way of meaningfully interacting with other individuals. The self is also a theoretical entity that can be hypothesized, meaning it is an entity that could be tested, could be measured in order to explain a huge array of important psychological phenomena. Or in other words, the self could be an entity where science could be utilized to measure the different psychological constructs pertaining to one's personality. Just like, for example, one of the most famous contribution of personality theorists was when they discovered the big five traits of personality. The big five traits are also known as the Ocean Five, or the O as in openness. It describes the person's openness to experience, the person's open mindedness, and the person's willingness to experience novel things. C is for conscientiousness. It merely describes how diligent and how is the person able to finish tasks and the kind of work that he or she is performing. E is for extroversion, meaning to say how open is the person to also engage in conversations, interactions, and how is the person fueled to be meeting and dealing with people, even with strangers. A is for agreeableness. Now, talking about agreeableness, it is one's ability to embrace and accept other people's opinions and how they value harmony in their day to day living. And lastly, N, which is about neuroticism. And talking about neuroticism, it is one's proneness to experience discomfort, illnesses, anxiety, sadness, and many uncomfortable conditions. Now, there are three important roots of selfhood, namely reflexive consciousness, interpersonal being, and the executive function. The reflexive consciousness is the conscious attention of turning back toward its own source and gradually constructing a concept of oneself. It is just like a person being given a feedback by a friend of how much he or she has changed, and then one could suddenly sat down with his or her feelings and tried to evaluate and assess what kind of person has he or she become. Another term for reflexive consciousness is also introspection. It means that one is able to reflect and analyze how has he been behaving so far in this stage of development. So when there will become a time that we start to also reflect on what have we and how have we become as individuals? Are we living in a productive and purposeful life? Then you are also trying to reflect using your reflexive consciousness, which is one of the roots of our selfhood. The second root is the interpersonal being, and that is the part of ourselves that have become handles and tools for relating to people. So when we get to also attend parties, interact with people we love, communicate with other people, and other means of interacting with individuals, may it be a stranger or a friend or a family member, then that is also how interpersonal being is being manifested. Now, the last route towards selfhood is the executive function, It is when one makes a resolution or a vow as a decision maker or a controller of oneself. So it is like one choosing to be an optimist or a pessimist. It is like when one uses his will on how to live his or her own life. As you can see, an optimist, no matter how challenging life is, no matter how hard life could be, still an optimist would rise up and be able to go on with life. But as you can see here on the other end, a pessimist, when life would give its spices and many different flavors, a pessimist could somehow ruin himself or herself. Like they would just intend to also sabotage the kind of life that they are also living. Now, according to James, a man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him and carry an image of him in their mind. It tells us that a man carries many different hats, or a man has many different personas or public selves that other individuals are identifying them as attributes that help distinguish that person's uniqueness amongst people. And to simply put it, it's like there are as many social selves as groups of individuals who know him, and that changes in behavior with different audiences resulted in practically a division into different selves. It's like we are actually a different person while we are with our family, and it could be that we are also a different individual whenever we are with our friends, or we could also be behaving differently while we are in school or while we are with our relatives. But it doesn't really tell us that these behaviors are not part of us. They are basically the many different images that also helps us describe who we are. Let's go now to the different prevailing issues on the nature of the self, including the self's existence and its dimensionality. Now, one of the most prevailing issues is actually the debate between the nature versus nurture. Up until today, it is an ongoing debate as to the most dominant force. May it be nature, meaning to say it is, or it talks about the natural basis of the self, which is anchored on biology and explains that human traits are passed from one generation to another. Or on the other end, we also have nurture, which tries to describe that the self should be principally viewed as an outcome of the various nurturing factors in the context of one's life. On the side of the nature's point of view, genetics, for example, contribute to so much information about the descriptions of the self. This field of biology primarily deals with heredity, or the transmission of the traits and the characteristics from one generation to another, as a process as well as with the characterizations of organisms. While on the context of the nurture's perspective, social sciences have provided a number of insights and explanations about the self, both on the micro and the macro levels. Like different social sciences stress how group life affects an individual's behavior and attitude, and emphasize the impact of the various social institutions to the self, construal to a person. While the issue about the predominance of either nature or nurture are still unresolved, one can safely assume that the self is a product of nature and nurture. Now, another issue that may arise when we talk about the self could be the disparity between identity and the self itself. Identity describes the qualities, the beliefs that a particular person is being identified as a unique individual amongst groups of people. And on the other hand, self is the entirety of the person as an individual. So, in other words, the person self could actually be composed of many different identities. To explain further, identity distinguishes or compares one from another, while the self refers to the total characteristics or qualities of a person, both known and the unknown factors known by others. Noticeably, the terms self and identity have been loosely interchanged in various literatures, and many people believe that there is a very thin conceptual and functional distinction between the two concepts, and thus perceive them as synonymous. Oyserman, Elmore, and Smith in 2012 further defined and provided a definition that underscores the distinctions and overlap between the self and identity. According to them, identities are the traits and the characteristics, social relations, the roles, and the social group memberships that define who one is. These identities can be focused on the past, what used to be true of one, the present, what is true of one now, or the future, the person one expects or wishes to become, or the person one feels obligated to try to become, or the person one fears one may become. Together, these identities make up one's self concept, variously described as what comes to mind when one thinks about oneself. So, in this particular definition, it is like further supported that identities could be tidbits of one's self. They provide the building blocks, or the tidbits of identities provide the different building blocks toward the development and comprising one's true self. Now, we will be talking about the dimensions of the self. Now, the identity of a person is highlighted by a dominant trait which makes him or her distinguishable from others. Like a situation where you're trying to describe a person whose name you cannot recall, and you will find yourself thinking of a remarkable or some remarkable traits that will make other people identify or even guess who you are talking about. Like you may start describing that this person is fat, tall, dark, and many other physical attributes. However, we could be prone to fall short with our description, since these descriptions might actually unspecific or not so unique in describing the person. And in most cases, the identity of a person can be best depicted using certain traits that would set him or her apart from others. So in this case, several observable traits should be combined to effectively describe the person. Like developmental and social scientists have identified the social factor, which refers to the influences of significant people in one's life. It primarily includes the family, in which most of the basic attitudinal and behavioral attributes of the individuals are shaped. Now, talking about social factors or factor, these are the characteristics that were acquired from the influences of the social groups during the formative years that are also integrated to form one's identity or uniqueness and similarities with others. So, like for example, when a neighbor would be describing us to be behaving like our father or our mother, or when our parents would also liken our behavior with our neighbors. And as one extends the horizon of his or her social connections, like in many different institutions, including the church, the neighbors, the friends, more and more characteristics are being integrated into one's self. Now, the second dimension of the self is personality, which is the individual's patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. It is said that no two people would have an identical personality, and that every individual is unique. One may share commonalities with other people, but will still possess an identity that sets him or her apart. Like, consider, for example, identical twins. They could be raised separately by different parents, they could be educated from different schools, and they grew up in different neighborhoods or communities. And the twins may share several common characteristics because they were born out of a single zygote, which carries their parents' DNA blueprints. The similarities may also go beyond physical characteristics and manifest in some manners and dispositions. And despite these similarities, the twins will still develop individual identities that make them distinct from one another. Like, for example, one may be assertive and the other could be timid. One could be sociable or friendly while the other one is aloof. And this tells us that identity does not connote exclusivity or outright difference against others. Instead, it refers to the sets of characteristics that make one a distinct and unique individual. Now, the third dimension of the self is the environmental factor, or are the environmental factors. They include the physical and communal elements present in everyday surroundings and are invariably dealt with by the individual in a specific geographic region or area. This factor covers not only the physical properties of the surroundings, but also the larger society or community, as well as the expectations and norms operating in that particular locality or place. Like, for example, you grew up in Mandaue City, where competitiveness and resiliency are needed in order to survive, and would tend to adapt to that kind of environment by consciously strengthening certain traits and skills that will manifest competitiveness. Or, in another example, you grew up in the grassroots where you were exposed to domestic violence, substance use, and many different vices that would also help you shape to be an individual who will likely to also develop a so-called ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder, or in another term, like in layman's term, it is called social pathology. or a sociopath. In clinical terms, social pathology or a sociopath is labeled as a person who is suffering from antisocial personality disorder. The individual could likely be prone to neglect other people's rights. They are prone to deceive other people. They act impulsively. They are irresponsible. They don't have work. They are prone to commit crimes over and over again, which are grounds for arrest. And they also don't show remorse in whatever bad things that they have done. And such exposure to detrimental factors or environmental factors could likely make one a sociopath. Now, the fourth factor is the hereditary factor, which describes the biological processes by which certain traits and characteristics are passed on from one generation to the other. As we discussed earlier, heredity is a biological process by which certain traits and characteristics are passed from one generation to another. And compared with the two previously discussed factors, heredity can be referred to the non-negotiable factor. So if one has the choice whether or not to adopt the influence of social groups and to change or improve one's environment, heredity is fixed and permanent. Now, the last dimension of the self is the person volition factor. Talking about volition, it actually or it is synonymously equivalent to the term will. It refers to the inclination of a person to form and construct a specific identity that will set him apart from others. Such factor emanates from within the mentality of an individual, brought about by aggregated social life experiences. Social scientists, like the sociologists, may refer to a person exhibiting person volition factor as a deviant or nonconformist. So, being one is not necessarily negative. In fact, some of the people of this type turned in to become trendsetters, revolutionaries, discoverers, and also inventors. Talking about this factor, it tells us that you are not easily influenced as a person by the many different things that people have tried or have suggested to you, and you remain to be firm with your conviction and your decision to continue with life in your own will, in your own means. As explained in this section, identity is a product of a complex process of combinations and integration of traits and characteristics from various possible sources. And some of these traits are acquired consciously and voluntarily, while others are obtained unconsciously and involuntarily. Now, try to test your awareness with your own identity. Together with this file, I am also uploading activity 1 and activity 2 in order for us to exercise and be able to probe our own identity. And we will continue to discuss some other topics later on as we continue.